We now turn to Libya. Concerns are mounting over the Islamic State's growing foothold in the country. U.S. officials are reportedly weighing a military response. Secretary of State John Kerry addressed the situation at a conference in Rome this week.
As everybody here knows, that country has resources. The last thing in the world you want is a false caliphate with access to billions of dollars of oil revenue.
Joining me now from Washington is Frederick Weary of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From Austin, Texas, Alan Kuperman of the London Johnson School of Public Affairs. With me here in New York, Jean-Marie Guéhenno. He is the president of the International Crisis Group. I am pleased to have all of them here. Let me just ask someone, and I'll start with you, Jean-Marie. Tell me the status on the ground today in Libya.
Well, the status on the ground in Libya is that you have a very fragmented country. There are two competing governments which have no control over the whole country, and you have the Islamic State with the main stronghold in Sirte, which used to be the stronghold of Gaddafi. And so at the moment there's an effort to bring all the various political actors of Libya together, but I believe it's still a long way off.
And ISIS is growing?
ISIS is growing. There are more foreign fighters coming to Libya. ISIS has been attacking oil facilities, and there's a fear that ISIS could expand, and that's why there is so much talk about a military option in Libya.
All right, let me read today from the New York Times. Eric Schmidt had a piece there, and basically he opened by saying President Obama is being pressed by some of his national security aides, including his top military advisors, to approve the use of American forces in Libya to open another front against the Islamic State. But Mr. Obama, wary of embarking on an intervention in another Muslim country, has told his aides to redouble their efforts to help form a unity government in Libya. At the same time, the Pentagon refines its options. How are they going about trying to define and put together a unity government? Frederick?
Well, these factions have signed an agreement that was brokered by the United Nations in December. The problem, though, is that this government is really just a government on paper. It hasn't been able to exert its authority on the ground yet. And I think that's the real concern in Washington and other European capitals is, who are they going to actually work with on the ground to combat the Islamic State?
And what's Europe doing? I mean, the Italians are very, very, I know, concerned about because of their relationship to Libya.
They're absolutely part of the effort. My understanding is that they're poised to help out with a possible stabilization force. I think the brunt of the counterterrorism effort, however, would be carried out by the British and the French.
The brunt of it, and including the United States?
Absolutely, and including the United States.
The president, I mean, clearly we all know and we're familiar with his understandable desire not to be drawn into too deeply, certainly with combat troops, and looking for what people call a kind of a small footprint. What are the military options being presented to him, Alan?
Well, I think that he's made clear that there isn't going to be a big intervention of U.S. combat forces on the ground, and in the absence of that, no country is going to put a large presence of U.S. combat forces. So what you're talking about is the same mix that you see in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, which is special operations forces, air power, and drones, essentially. And the problem is that you need to partner with somebody on the ground. And as your other guests explained, there is no unified Libyan military force to partner with. So if we partner with Militia A, then Militia B is going to view us as the enemy, and they're going to actually ally with the Islamic State and strengthen the Islamic State. So most people think that if you really want to crush the Islamic State, first you need a unified government, then you need a unified Libyan military, and only then can a Western military intervention help that local military force actually destroy the Islamic State. In the absence of that, if we intervene, we're basically just going to be hitting a hornet's nest. We'll scatter the Islamic State, but we will not destroy the Islamic State.
So how do we get the unity government then?
It's really hard because the only reason that the opposing factions in Libya are even thinking about a unity government is because of the threat of ISIS. And so if we actually go in and damage ISIS, then the competing factions in Libya will have less incentive to unify. So it's a little bit of a game of chicken, and it's not that different from what was going on in Iraq, the same sort of thing. If we had attacked ISIS with full force, then the government in Baghdad would have had no incentive to make a deal with the Sunni in Iraq. It's a very similar sort of thing. You obviously don't want ISIS to seize large swaths of territory or oil fields, but you don't want to go in and be the army that destroys ISIS, because then there'll be no unification in Libya, and that will foster ISIS in the long run.
The military advisors and the national security people who are advising some kind of response in coordination with the unity government have to be fearful of what ISIS might do. How do they see the threat?
Well, I think ISIS at the moment does not have a capacity to have a major expansion. What we have seen recently of ISIS is that they have attacked oil facilities, but it's hit-and-run operations, it's suicide bombers, a major ground offensive. I think it's hard to see. What could happen, and there are some places in Libya with very weak forces like Bani Walid where the ISIS could attack. But I agree with the previous speaker. The war against ISIS is not going to be won with bombs. It's going to be won by people who are on the ground and who are prepared to fight. And those people have to be Libyans. And there, when you look at the politics today, they are very divisive figures. You have in the eastern part of Libya, you have a General Haftar, who is seen as anti-Islamist. But he doesn't have the capacity to defeat ISIS. If you want to defeat ISIS, you need to peel off some of the Islamist group. And if you have a big military operation with bombings, you might have the opposite result. You might have people who join ISIS instead of being peeled off ISIS. So I understand President Obama's hesitation.
Some people argue that this is, including Vladimir Putin, that this was the problem with overthrowing the Libyan government and supporting it the way we did. I mean, I think even Bob Gates was opposed to doing what we did at that time. Is there some resonance in that argument when historians look at what's happened in Libya? Alan? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly. This Libyan situation, unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, where President Obama could argue that this was a negative legacy left to him by his predecessor, George W. Bush, the Libyan catastrophe is of President Obama's own making. Here was a country that was led by a leader that was actually an ally in the war on terror. It was not a perfect country. It was reforming, but it was not a safe haven for terrorists. And what President Obama did is he went in and he destroyed Libya. He created anarchy. He created a failed state. And in that vacuum is where ISIS has come in and now presents a threat not only to the region but to U.S. national security interests. And the great irony is that President Obama ran his whole campaign in 2008, or his main part of his campaign, was criticizing President Bush for destroying Iraq and creating a threat to the region and to U.S. national security. And then 8 years later, President Obama did almost the exact same thing in Libya. It's something that I think historians are going to puzzle over for decades.
Well, as we all remember at the time, I mean, there was a whole lot of threats coming from Gaddafi that he was going to go into Benghazi and kill everything in sight. The French were strongly arguing that we had to go in on humanitarian grounds, and I think the president had some advisors who were saying you have to do this on humanitarian grounds at the time.
He did indeed. Most prominently, Susan Rice and Samantha Power were saying that there was an incipient genocide in Benghazi. Even, some of us at the time thought that this was unlikely to be the case. But now that we have more and more evidence, we have a UN investigation of what was going on, it is clear that Gaddafi was not repeat, not targeting civilians. He was targeting rebels, and the war was about to come to an end because the rebels were losing and were about to be chased out of the country. And at that moment, the rebels came up with this idea, oh, if we can claim that there's going to be a genocide here, then we can get the U.S. and NATO to come in, intervene on our behalf, overthrow Gaddafi, and we'll have our own country. And unfortunately, President Obama's advisors, including Hillary Clinton, fell for that propaganda, and then the president fell for that propaganda. So, you know, it's like the Who song, you know, we should not get fooled again.
But there is a great sense that, I mean, people are arguing, obviously, in Washington that they've got to do something now. You cannot allow ISIS to grow because of the oil revenues that are possible there and all of that, that you've got to do something. That's the argument of the moment, is it not?
Yeah, and I think the real mistake in 2011 was not necessarily the military operation, was the absence of a political follow-up.
Right.
And I think today we run the risk of making exactly the same mistake.
The whole notion is what after Gaddafi.
And now the whole notion is what kind of government can you build in Libya? And there, the focus on the hardware, the focus on the bombs, I think makes people forget about what can be done on the politics. And on the politics, much more can be done. I would say Libya was never a real country. It's a combination of tribes. And if you want to have a political success in Libya, you need to work from the bottom up. The situation in Benghazi is not the situation in Sirte, it's not the situation in Tripoli, and that's what you need really to work at. And that's, I think, to be honest, I think there's been a bit of neglect of Libya in the last 2 years, and that needs to change. Yeah. Political neglect.
Frederick, my impression is that the president, go ahead, you may want to comment on that before I'll come back to you.
Libya under Gaddafi, there were no real state institutions, so there was no state to destroy. I mean, the army was virtually non-existent, you know, under Gaddafi. So I think the real problem was not necessarily the decision to intervene, which was not, you know, Obama himself, but was Arab League, it was the Europeans as well. But the follow-up, I mean, there was that crucial first year where I think the international community in the West was so focused on helping Libya with elections that they neglected the security situation. They neglected the buildup of the militias, building a strong army and police. The spinal cord that you really need to ensure a successful democracy was neglected. And that comes to me from acknowledgments from the United Nations and other diplomats. So that's the real problem. But we are where we are now, and I think the real challenge, as was stated, is building viable institutions, a government, police, democratic rule of law. I mean, these are the things that are going to ensure that extremism doesn't come back. And the Islamic State cannot be defeated through bombs alone.
But at the same, and obviously the president understands that and has said that often in forums about the whole campaign against the Islamic State and defending what he's done in Syria. Yet, at the same time, I mean, he's concerned about ISIS, and he's concerned about ISIS and territory, because territory is a recruiting tool for ISIS. Right. And the idea becomes, you know, what kind of footprint, what kind of military combination without so-called grounds on the troops and on the boots on the ground and all of that. So what kind of footprint could he do that might have some impact, whether it's commandos, whether it's special forces, whether it's some kind of paramilitary CIA, whether it's advisors working with what?
I think what is going to transpire if it does is commandos working with militias. And I absolutely agree with the other speaker that there's a huge risk when you start partnering with militias that you're going to further fracture the country and, you know, create warlordism. But I think what they may be calculating is that they will only give assistance to factions on the ground that support this new unity government. So we cannot, the president probably believes, and I think his advisors are saying, we cannot wait for a Libyan army to form because it's going to be years. It could be a decade. And they can't wait that long to have a credible partner on the ground. So they're going to go to war with whatever they have on the ground and try to mitigate the damage to unity and to political stability.
How long do you think before we'll see a decision by the president?
I don't know what the calculus is on this. I firmly believe they're really trying to get a settlement, you know, to get this unity government to agree on the formation of its military structure. The real sticking point, going back to your other speaker, is the inclusion of this general in the East that is considered a rogue general by many quarters that has launched this campaign that is very polarizing. So the question about, what do you do with him is really holding up the formation of this unity government.
You're one of the people that were quoted in the New York Times article.
Right.
Is there division within the administration about this? I mean, the military, the Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs seem to be the people recommending a military response. Is there division at the National Security Council and within the other advisors to the president, at state or wherever they might be?
I'm not aware of that. No, I don't know that. No.
Okay. So essentially what the president has said, I hear the problem, give me some more options, and let's see what we can do about getting behind some kind of unity government.
I think that's right. I mean, the military's job is to prepare for contingency. We know there are reports of special ops troops on the ground, liaising, trying to figure out who they can work with. And they've probably given the president a menu of options, and it's up to him to decide, when to execute.